aback, abed, ably, abnormally, aboard, above, abroad, abruptly, absolutely, absurdly, abundantly, accidentally, accordingly, accurately, across, actively, actually, acutely, additionally, adequately, admirably, adversely, afar, affectionately, afloat, afresh, after, afterward, afterwards, again, aggressively, ago, aground, ahead, aimlessly, alike, all, allegedly, almost, aloft, alone, along, alongside, aloud, already, also, alternatively, altogether, always, amazingly, amply, anew, annually, anxiously, anyhow, anymore, anyplace, anytime, anyway, anywhere, apart, apparently, appropriately, approvingly, approximately, aptly, arbitrarily, around, artfully, artificially, ashore, aside, assuredly, astonishingly, atop, attentively, automatically, awfully, awkwardly, backstage, backward, backwards, badly, barely, basically, beautifully, before, beforehand, behind, below, beneath, besides, bitterly, blatantly, blindly, bluntly, boldly, both, bravely, briefly, brightly, brilliantly, broadly, brutally, busily, calmly, candidly, carefully, carelessly, casually, categorically, cautiously, certainly, characteristically, cheerfully, cheerily, chiefly, chronically, classically, cleanly, clearly, cleverly, clockwise, closely, clumsily, coarsely, coincidentally, coldly, comfortably, commonly, comparatively, completely, conceivably, conclusively, concurrently, confidently, consciously, consequently, considerably, consistently, conspicuously, constantly, continually, continuously, conveniently, conventionally, conversely, convincingly, coolly, correctly, correspondingly, counterclockwise, courteously, covertly, critically, crudely, cruelly, curiously, currently, customarily, daily, dangerously, darkly, deadly, deathly, decidedly, decisively, deep, deeply, defensively, definitely, deftly, deliberately, delicately, densely, dependably, desperately, differently, diligently, dimly, directly, distinctively, distinctly, distinguishingly, domestically, doubtlessly, down, downhill, downstairs, downstream, downward, downwards, downwind, dramatically, drastically, dreadfully, dutifully, each, eagerly, early, earnestly, easily, east, eastward, eastwards, economically, effectively, efficiently, effortlessly, either, elaborately, elegantly, elsewhere, emotionally, emphatically, empirically, endlessly, energetically, enormously, enough, enthusiastically, entirely, equally, erroneously, especially, essentially, eternally, ethically, even, evenly, eventually, ever, evermore, everywhere, evidently, exactly, exceedingly, exceptionally, excessively, exclusively, expertly, explicitly, expressly, exquisitely, extensively, externally, extra, extraordinarily, extremely, faintly, fairly, faithfully, falsely, famously, far, farther, fast, favorably, fervently, fiercely, figuratively, finally, financially, finely, firmly, first, fittingly, flatly, fondly, foolishly, forcefully, forcibly, forever, formally, formally, forthwith, fortunately, forward, forwards, frankly, frantically, freely, frequently, freshly, friendly, fully, fundamentally, furiously, furthermore, generally, generously, gently, genuinely, gingerly, gladly, globally, gracefully, graciously, gradually, gratefully, gravely, greatly, grossly, grudgingly, habitually, handily, happily, hardly, harshly, hastily, haughtily, heartily, heavily, hence, henceforward, here, hereafter, hesitantly, high, highly, hitherto, home, honestly, hopefully, hopelessly, horizontally, horribly, hotly, hourly, however, hugely, humbly, hurriedly, ideally, idly, illegally, immediately, immensely, impartially, impatiently, implicitly, impossibly, improperly, inadequately, inappropriately, incidentally, incorrectly, increasingly, incredibly, indeed, indefinitely, independently, indirectly, individually, indoors, inevitably, infinitely, informally, infrequently, ingeniously, inherently, initially, inland, inside, instantaneously, instantly, instead, instinctively, intellectually, intelligently, intensely, intensively, intentionally, intently, internally, internationally, intimately, intrinsically, intuitively, invariably, involuntarily, inward, inwardly, ironically, irregularly, just, justifiably, justly, keenly, kindly, knowingly, laboriously, largely, last, lastly, late, lately, later, lavishly, lazily, least, left, legally, legitimately, leisurely, less, liberally, lightly, lightly, likewise, literally, locally, loftily, logically, loosely, loudly, lovingly, low, loyally, luckily, madly, magically, mainly, markedly, massively, materially, maximally, maybe, meantime, meanwhile, mechanically, mentally, mercifully, merely, merrily, metaphorically, methodically, mightily, mildly, minimally, miraculously, miserably, mistakenly, moderately, modestly, momentarily, monthly, morally, more, moreover, most, mostly, much, mutually, namely, narrowly, nationally, nationwide, naturally, near, nearby, nearly, neatly, necessarily, needlessly, negatively, neither, nervously, never, nevermore, nevertheless, newly, next, nicely, noisily, nonetheless, nor, normally, north, northward, northwards, notably, noticeably, notoriously, now, nowadays, nowhere, objectively, obviously, occasionally, oddly, offensively, officially, often, oftentimes, once, only, unstage, onward, onwards, openly, orally, ordinarily, originally, ostensibly, otherwise, outdoors, outside, outward, outwardly, outwards, over, overhead, overly, overnight, overseas, overtly, painfully, painstakingly, partially, particularly, partly, passionately, passively, past, patently, patiently, peacefully, peculiarly, perennially, perfectly, perhaps, periodically, permanently, perpetually, persistently, personally, physically, plainly, pleasantly, politely, politically, poorly, popularly, positively, possibly, potentially, powerfully, practically, precariously, precisely, predominantly, presently, presumably, pretty, previously, primarily, principally, privately, probably, profoundly, profusely, progressively, prominently, promptly, properly, proudly, publicly, purely, purportedly, purposefully, purposelessly, purposely, qualitatively, quantitatively, quarterly, quick, quickly, quietly, quite, radically, randomly, rapidly, rarely, rather, rationally, readily, really, reasonably, recently, recklessly, regardless, regionally, regrettably, regularly, relatively, relentlessly, relevantly, reliably, reluctantly, remarkably, remotely, repeatedly, reportedly, resolutely, respectfully, respectively, responsibly, reverently, richly. Ridiculously, right, rightfully, rightly, rigidly, rigorously, roughly, routinely, rudely, ruthlessly. Sadly, safely, sarcastically, satisfactorily, savagely, scarcely, scientifically, secretly, securely, seemingly. Seldom, self-consciously, sensibly, separately, serenely, seriously, severely, sharply, shortly, sideways. Significantly, silently, similarly, simply, simultaneously, sincerely, skillfully, skyward, slightly, slow. Slowly, smartly, smoothly, so, softly, solely, solemnly, solidly, someday, somehow. Someplace, sometime, sometimes, somewhat, somewhere, soon, south, southward, southwards, sparsely. Specially, specifically, speedily, spiritually, spontaneously, squarely, startlingly, statistically, steadily, stealthily. Steeply, sternly, stiffly, still, straight, straightforward, straightway, strangely, strictly, strikingly. Strongly, stubbornly, stunningly, subjectively, subsequently, substantially, subtly, successfully, such, suddenly. Sufficiently, suitably, superbly, supposedly, surely, surprisingly, surreptitiously, suspiciously, sweetly, swiftly. Sympathetically, systematically, temporarily, tenderly, tentatively, terribly, thankfully, that, then, theoretically. There, thereafter, thereby, therefore, therefore, thereof, thickly, thinly, thoroughly, though. Thus, tight, tightly, today, together, tomorrow, tonight, too, totally, tragically. Tremendously, truly, truthfully, twice, typically, ultimately, unawares, unbelievably, uncertainly, uncharacteristically. Uncomfortably, unconsciously, under, underfoot, underground, underneath, undoubtedly, unduly, uneasily, unevenly. Unexpectedly, unfairly, unfortunately, unhappily, uniformly, unintentionally, uniquely, unjustly, unknowingly, unluckily. Unnecessarily, unquestionably, unsuccessfully, unusually, unwittingly, up, uphill, upon, upstairs, upstream. Upward, upwards, usually, utterly, vaguely, vastly, vehemently, verbally, verbatim, vertically. Very, viciously, vigorously, violently, virtually, virtuously, visibly, voluntarily, warmly, weakly. Weakly, west, westward, westwards, whence, whenever, wherever, wholly, wide, widely. Wildly, willfully, willingly, windward, wisely, wonderfully, worldwide, wrong, wrongly, yearly. Yesterday, yet,